A woman shoots her husband right in the face, several shots in a row, at point-blank range, without a single cry for help. And then this woman falls silent and doesn't say a single word for 6 long years. Not in court, not to the doctors, not to her own lawyer. Just a deep, heavy silence she sinks into, like water closing over her head. Everyone around her is certain. She's a cold-blooded killer who simply refuses to explain herself. But what if that silence isn't a refusal at all, but the only way she has left to survive? Today you'll learn the story of a painter named Alicia Berenson and the man who swore to make her speak, whatever it took. But the deeper he digs, the clearer one unsettling thing becomes. This story doesn't have one unreliable narrator, it has 2. And the one you trust the most turns out to be the most dangerous of all. Subscribe so you don't miss the breakdowns that make you see the people around you differently. No fluff in half an hour. Alicia Berenson, a successful painter, once picked up a rifle and shot her own husband. They had been married for about 7 years, and both of them were artists. She painted, and he was a sought-after fashion photographer, shooting slender, hollow-eyed models for glossy magazines. From the outside, they looked like the perfect couple. A beautiful house in North London, recognition, money, the quiet envy of everyone who knew them. That evening, her husband came home late from a shoot. A neighbor heard gunshots about half an hour later and called the police. When the officers entered the house, the lights weren't on. They made their way through the dark rooms with flashlights and found Alicia standing by the fireplace in a white dress, motionless, as if carved from ice, her face frozen in terror. A rifle lay on the floor. A little further off, tied to a chair with thick cord at the ankles and wrists, sat her husband, Gabriel. His head hung to one side. At first, the officers thought he was simply unconscious, but when they raised the flashlight higher, they saw what could no longer be mistaken for a fainting spell. Several shots, fired point blank, straight into his face. There was far too much blood, even for a wound like that. One of the officers took hold of Alicia's wrists to stop the bleeding, and found fresh, deep cuts on both. The young woman was rushed to the hospital unconscious. She survived, but when she woke, she didn't say a word. No question ever broke the seal on her lips, not at the hospital, not during the arrest, not in court. Alicia neither admitted guilt nor denied it. She simply stayed silent. And that silence turned out to be more eloquent than any confession. The press pounced on the story like a bloody delicacy, and an ordinary domestic killing turned into a sensation that dominated the headlines for months. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Neighbors happily gave interviews. Acquaintances of the couple traded theories back and forth, and only the accused herself said absolutely nothing. The neighbor who called the police that night soon became something of a media figure herself. A journalist by trade, she gladly repeated the details to anyone willing to listen, clearly savoring her sudden connection to a headline case. At trial, Alicia's lawyer tried to argue that his client was unfit to stand trial because of a severe psychological breakdown, while the prosecution insisted on a cold, calculated murder. The courtroom went still every single time the judge addressed Alicia directly, and every single time, the same silence fell, the kind that sent a chill down even the most hardened reporters' spines. In the end, the judge sided with the defense, largely thanks to the testimony of an influential professor of forensic psychiatry who ran a secure clinic called The Grove. Alicia was sentenced to a long prison term, but instead of an ordinary prison, she was sent to The Grove, under permanent psychiatric supervision, with the faint promise of early release should her mental state ever recover. Cynics muttered that all it would take was a mumbled word of remorse. Months passed, then years, and Alicia never said a single word. There's one more detail that got far less coverage. While the trial was underway, Alicia, already under house arrest, barely ate or slept, and painted like someone possessed. It usually took her weeks, sometimes months, to finish a new painting. This time, she finished it in just a few days. A self-portrait, a naked woman at an easel, brush in hand, something dripping from its tip that might be paint or might be blood. Her lips parted in a silent scream, the canvas in front of her left blank. In the corner, she painted the title in pale blue Greek letters, Alcestis. the name of a heroine from Greek mythology who willingly agreed to die in her husband's place because no one else was willing to make that sacrifice. What could a tragic legend of self-sacrifice possibly have to do with a woman who shot her own husband? The answer will come, but not for a while yet. To understand what happened that night, it helps to go back a little further to who Alicia was before silence closed in around her name. She had drawn since childhood. Alicia's mother died when she was still a small girl, officially an accident, an overdose of sleeping pills. For years, Alicia believed it had been suicide, and as she grew older, she began to suspect something darker. Her father, left alone with her, was a cold and cruel man. She remembered overhearing him say it would have been better if she had died instead of her mother. The one bright spot of her childhood was her cousin Paul. With him, she raced bicycles across fields of wild daisies and hid in abandoned, overgrown houses. And that distant summer stayed in her memory forever, golden and unreachable, as if it belonged to some kinder life. Once she grew up, Alicia enrolled in art school, where it quickly became clear her talent wasn't just diligence, but a rare, almost unsettling gift for seeing what other people preferred not to notice. It was there, still a student, that she had her first severe breakdown, an attempt to end her own life, something only her closest circle ever knew about, and which she later carefully erased from her story as a successful artist. A few years later, she met Gabriel, and finally found the one thing she'd been missing her whole life: security. In her diary, she admitted she loved him so much it frightened her. Love like that rarely comes to people with her history, and she feared one day losing it. The wedding, her first solo show, growing recognition in art world circles. From the outside, Alicia's life looked like a story of triumphant recovery. But this is exactly where the diary makes everything genuinely interesting. Because Alicia's last notebook breaks off just days before the murder, and then months of silence. That gap becomes the central mystery of the whole story. When I first read about this, I caught myself thinking that the image of a perfect love and the image of someone capable of killing simply refuse to fit into the same picture. And it's exactly in that mismatch that the whole truth of the book is hiding. Now it's time to meet the man through whose eyes we actually experience this entire story. Theo Faber is a forensic psychotherapist who spent years working at a secure clinic for the most severe psychiatric offenders, among killers and people who had lost their grip on reality. The moment he read about Alicia's case in the news, he became almost obsessed with getting assigned as her therapist. Theo insists he sees her silence not as stubbornness, but as a cry for help no one ever bothered to hear, and swears that he, of all people, can finally get through to a patient who defeated the country's best specialists. Theo tells us very little about himself, and very selectively. He had a difficult childhood and a volatile, domineering father, and it was his own therapist, a woman named Ruth, who helped him survive it. A woman who, in his words, quite literally saved his life. He's now married to an actress named Kathy, but a strange, almost unhealthy unease runs through the way he describes their marriage. One moment he's endlessly tender and grateful fate ever brought them together. The next he's catching suspicious glances and unfinished sentences whose meaning he seems almost afraid to put into words, even to himself. Before the Grove, Theo spent years working at Broadmoor, one of the most notorious secure hospitals for the criminally insane, where he witnessed dozens of stories far more violent than Alicia's case. He takes pride in his composure, in his ability to hold professional distance where most colleagues would lose their nerve, and he genuinely believes he's a man who has worked through his own childhood wounds and come out the other side a stronger, more perceptive therapist. Every so often, though, something like quiet pride slips into his reasoning over his gift for spotting other people's lies. A gift, as it later turns out, he might have done better to turn on himself first. He speaks of his mentor Ruth with something close to filial warmth. She's the reason he chose the profession of therapist in the first place, the woman who once, late one evening years ago, listened to the confessions of a frightened, traumatized young man and didn't turn away. Theo genuinely believes this story proves that conversation alone can save absolutely anyone, and it seems his entire life since has become an attempt to repeat that rescue himself, this time cast not as the patient, but as the savior. When a position opens up at the secure clinic called The Grove, Theo drops his old job on the spot and transfers there, with exactly one goal in mind: to get access to Alicia Berenson. He tells himself, and everyone else, that he's driven by professional passion and genuine compassion for a cornered woman. But from the very first pages, there's a creeping sense that the real reason is buried far deeper, and that he either doesn't recognize it himself or is carefully hiding it, even from his own thoughts, skirting every uncomfortable question along the way. The Grove turns out to be a bleak, run-down place the state hasn't invested a dime more than necessary in for years. Peeling walls, bars on the windows, the permanent smell of disinfectant and medication. The staff match the building. Tired, cynical people, long past being surprised by anything. His colleague Indira greets the newcomer warily and tells him flat out that the country's best therapists have already tried working with Alicia, and every one of them failed. Professor Diomedes, the head of the clinic and a man with his own agenda when it comes to Alicia's case, is in no hurry to let Theo near the patient, suspecting unhealthy curiosity. Yuri, the male nurse, is perhaps the only person at the clinic Alicia shows any warmth toward at all, simply because he never demands anything of her. Among the other patients, a large, volatile woman named Elif stands out. She has long resented Alicia, and one day, catching a moment when the staff aren't watching, she slashes one of the painter's few new canvases. The incident is a stark reminder of just how fragile and dangerous a place the Grove really is. Behind every locked door isn't an abstract diagnosis, but a living, wounded human being, capable of causing harm or suffering it at any moment. The first sessions between Theo and Alicia become a one-man show. He talks, she stays silent, staring straight through him at some fixed point. He brings in reproductions of her own paintings, tries every technique he's ever learned from textbooks and years of practice. Nothing works. Anyone else would have given up long ago and moved on to a less hopeless patient. But Theo, with an almost unhealthy stubbornness, keeps coming back, session after session, week after week, as if it isn't his career on the line, but his own life. By the way, if you've ever spent time pounding on a locked door, trying to reach someone who flatly refuses to hear you, write about it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how many of us have been through something like that. Gradually, after long months of fruitless sessions, the first small breakthrough arrives. Alicia begins to react to Theo's presence, if only slightly, not in words, but in barely noticeable gestures. A shift in her gaze, the way she stops pressing herself back into the chair when he walks in. One day, she takes the pencil he holds out and makes a few marks on a sheet of paper, her first voluntary action in years. For Theo, this isn't just a professional victory. He experiences it almost as a personal miracle. The real turning point comes when Theo learns that Alicia kept a diary, a notebook she wrote in during the final weeks before the murder, which, it turns out, has been sitting all this time with the gallery owner Jean Felix, an old family friend. Getting hold of the pages proves harder than expected, but Theo doesn't hesitate for a second, even though he technically has no right to the diary at all. And the diary reveals a completely different Alicia. Not the silent statue from the courtroom, but a living, anxious, sharply observant woman who, in the middle of a freak summer heat wave, is trying to finish a painting for an important show while sensing that something in her marriage is coming apart. She describes the scorched city, sleepless nights with no air conditioning, the fan she drags from room to room just to make the heat bearable. On the way to her favorite cafe, she finds a dead bird on a path, and that image of death lingers in her mind for the rest of the day, resurfacing at the worst moments. Gabriel, meanwhile, is pulling away. He disappears on shoots longer than usual, gives one-word answers, and one day Alicia is horrified to realize she's accidentally painted not the biblical figure she meant to paint, but her own husband's face, as if her hand were writing a truth her mind still refuses to accept. Toward the final entries, the anxiety turns openly frantic. Alicia senses that someone came to see Gabriel while she was in her garden studio, and he flatly refuses to explain who it was. By the way, Alicia's behavior after the tragedy isn't just a literary device, it's a genuinely recognizable mechanism in real psychology. When what someone has lived through becomes too enormous for words to hold, the mind sometimes shuts down speech itself as a protective reflex. Not because the person has nothing to say, but because saying it out loud would mean living through the entire horror all over again. That's exactly why the people around someone like this so often mistake the silence for stubbornness or pretense, when in reality, they're looking at the most extreme form of self-protection a mind pushed to its limit can produce. I remember when I first read this part of the book, I genuinely got chills, because the entries cut off just a few lines before the murder, and you can physically feel the noose tightening around this family, with nothing you can do about it. But that's not all. Theo doesn't stop at the therapy sessions. He also runs his own investigation on the side, almost like a detective, even though it's nowhere near his actual job. He meets with Gabriel's brother, the lawyer Max Berenson, and immediately senses an inexplicable hostility, whether ordinary wariness toward a stranger or some old family resentment nobody wants to talk about. He tracks down the aunt who raised Alicia after the tragedy, and hears a version of her niece's childhood nothing like the one Alicia wrote in her diary, a far darker version in which the father comes across very differently. He visits Jean-Félix again, talks to former neighbors, and even tries to track down an old university friend who knew about Alicia's first, unsuccessful attempt to take her own life. There's also a nearly separate detective thread involving her cousin Paul, that same boy from her golden childhood summer, who's grown up now and seems never to have fully let go of his attachment to his cousin. Theo tries to figure out whether Paul played any role in the tragedy, but every lead in the investigation runs into the same wall. Too many people around Alicia are hiding something, and too few of them are willing to say so directly. The more Theo learns, the clearer it becomes. Alicia had far more reasons to stay silent than simple shock at what she'd done. Maybe it isn't about Gabriel's murder at all, but about something far older, a childhood trauma that's been simmering for years and finally found a new outlet to break free through. Has it ever felt to you like someone else's silence is more frightening than any scream? Tell me in the comments. I think it's a pretty universal feeling, one most of us have experienced at least once. Meanwhile, a strange tension is building in Theo's own life too. He stays late at the office more and more, spends less and less time at home, and his wife Kathy grows only more withdrawn and joyless, spending whole evenings slumped in front of the television with a bag of chips, as if she too has nothing left to say. He seems genuinely worried about her, even suggests finding her a good therapist and going together, but something about these scenes feels off, as if he's methodically playing the role of a caring husband without actually feeling what he's supposed to feel. At the same time, suspicions are quietly building among his colleagues at the clinic. Someone on staff behaved strangely around the time an unknown visitor came to see Gabriel that fateful evening. One of the other therapists, Christian, an old acquaintance of Theo's from his previous job, starts to look more and more suspicious, whether because of his own old sins or simply because he keeps turning up in the right place at the right moment, far too often to be coincidence. I'll be honest, at this exact point I was completely convinced I knew where the story was headed, certain of my own theory about who the guilty party was, and, as it turned out later, I was wrong on almost every count. And now comes the part that, honestly, makes the entire book worth reading from start to finish. The ending turns the whole story inside out. It turns out that the mysterious man who came to see Gabriel shortly before the murder wasn't some random visitor or an outside suspect at all. It was Theo himself. A year earlier, he had learned that his wife Kathy was having an affair with Gabriel, and the decision to walk into that house and tell Alicia the truth about her husband had nothing to do with nobility, and everything to do with a cold, carefully nursed need to inflict pain in return. Hiding his face behind a mask and disguising his voice, he showed up at the Berensons' home to destroy someone else's marriage, almost as revenge for his own pain, and coldly told Alicia that her husband was seeing his wife. Alicia's reaction turned out to be far more devastating than he had imagined. The truth of Gabriel's betrayal collided head-on with a long-buried childhood wound, with that same cold voice of her father, insisting for years it would have been better if she had died instead of her mother. Something inside her broke completely in seconds, and it was in that moment, not as part of any premeditated plan, that the rifle ended up in her hands. Theo insists he never meant for anyone to die. He only wanted to expose the truth and walk away. But instead of confessing, he chose an entirely different path. Get himself hired at the clinic treating his victim, become her therapist, control every word she might one day say, and quietly find out whether she had recognized him behind the mask. Once it becomes clear that Alicia's diary, now in his hands, contains far too many details dangerous to him, Theo stops at nothing. He carefully sets up Christian, an entirely innocent man, and hands him over to the police as the prime suspect without a flicker of guilt. And when Alicia starts showing the first troubling signs that she remembers and has recognized her tormentor, he injects her with a lethal dose of medication, putting his patient into a coma, anything to keep her silence permanent and himself safe. Theo genuinely believes he acted with good intentions, or at least he tells himself that story very convincingly, over and over. He gets the promotion he's been waiting for, takes over the clinic, comes home each evening to a wife who still looks at him with confusion and a quiet suspicion, as if she senses something she can't or won't put into words. But one loose thread remains. Alicia's diary, which Theo searched for so desperately in her emptied hospital room, tearing through boxes of her belongings, wasn't anywhere he looked for it. The notebook had been hidden inside the frame of that very painting, the self-portrait with the telling title, wedged tightly behind the canvas. Inspector Allen, the detective on the case, finds the pages by accident when the painting is brought in to be collected for a new exhibition, and decides to stop by Theo's house, ostensibly to clear up a few loose details. Outside, the season's first snow is just beginning to fall. Settled at the kitchen table over a cup of tea, the inspector quietly pulls out a worn leather notebook and begins reading aloud. Calmly at first, almost casually, then watching the host's face more closely with every line, who listens with striking composure, gazing out at the falling snow. And the last lines we hear are the opening words of that very incriminating entry, the one where Theo's name appears exactly where it was never supposed to. The author cuts the story off right there, leaving the reader alone with the silence, nearly as thick and heavy as the one Alicia herself disappeared into for 6 long years. And here's what genuinely gets under your skin about this story. The whole time, we assumed the silent patient was Alicia, but the truly silent one, all those years, was actually her own therapist, a man who knew how to speak beautifully, convincingly, professionally, and never once said the one true thing about himself out loud. The book is built on 2 unreliable narrators at once, which is exactly why it's so fascinating to reread. Knowing the ending, you suddenly notice how many clues the author dropped from the very first pages, in the phrasing itself, in the things left unsaid, in how persistently Theo dodges every direct question, and you, like every character in the book, simply chose not to notice. There's another layer to this story worth mentioning. Alicia's silence isn't spite or revenge against the people around her. It's a recognizable psychological response to unbearable pain, the point where words simply stop being able to do the job, and a person retreats into silence because it's the only shelter left. And the myth of Alcestis, given as the title of that self-portrait, works as a mirror for both characters at once. Alicia, like the mythical heroine, sacrifices herself to someone else's lie and betrayal, while Theo casts himself as the savior, even as he destroys everything he touches, wrapped in the language of care and therapy. It's worth noting how the author builds the shape of the story too. For nearly the entire book, we hear Theo's voice, confident, warm, full of sympathy for his unfortunate patient, while alongside it we read fragments of Alicia's diary, written in a completely different tone, anxious and unsteady. These 2 voices seem to compete for our trust, and for most of the book we side, without noticing, with the narrator who sounds calmer and more professional. And that's exactly where the book's real trap lies. It shows that a confident tone is no guarantee of truth. Sometimes it's simply the easiest way to hide it. It's easy to see why this became one of the most talked about psychological thrillers of recent years, landing on reading lists right alongside other famous stories of deception like Gone Girl. Readers around the world admitted that almost no one guessed the final twist. Most instead built one wrong theory after another, right up to the last pages. And that, perhaps, is the real secret of its success. The book doesn't just surprise you with an unexpected turn, it makes you doubt your own ability to tell sincerity apart from a well-rehearsed performance. We read so you can save hours. Want more breakdowns like this? Support the channel. Every bit helps fund new videos. Thanks for watching. In the end, Alicia Berenson's story was never really about who pulled the trigger. It's about how easily silence turns into a prison, and how convenient it can be for certain people to keep that silence going, just so they never have to answer for their own words and actions. Subscribe if you want to keep finding books that shift your perspective instead of just entertaining you. Burning books is a crime, but not reading them is even worse. We fix that in half an hour. Subscribe.